I feel like one of the weird side effects of this pandemic is that suddenly I can't stop thinking about Edward Hopper. Edward Hopper was a 20th century painter who painted lots of pictures of cities and a lot of pictures of people by themselves, looking very, very forlorn and very vulnerable. And the paintings have these kind of understated, ominous names like night windows and morning sun and sun in an empty room that just kind of make them seem even sadder. The paintings are kind of a testament to the experience of loneliness and isolation. So, they're rather apropos for the era of quarantine and social distancing. This past March, The Guardian ran an article called "We Are All Edward Hopper Paintings Now." This week we were, having our worship planning meeting, getting ready for this Sunday, and, talking about, what is the photo theme gonna be? And I said, well, I'm maybe talking about Edward Hopper, so maybe people could just send in pictures of them, looking sad and alone. And, everyone kind of looked at me like, what's wrong with you? And Lisa said, what if we just did social justice instead? And everyone was like, yeah, that's probably better. But when I see Edward Hopper paintings, I don't think of the COVID-19 pandemic as much as what really comes up for me is my first year of ministry, the first year after I arrived in Memphis. And this was a time when, by all outward appearances, things were going pretty darn well for me. I was finally doing this work that I loved, that I'd spent years training to do, and the congregation that I served was growing and was energized, and I had my picture in the newspaper, and every week of my life I would get up in this pulpit and I would preach a sermon, and then I would walk up those stairs and people would wait in line for 20 minutes for their chance to come shake my hand and tell me how brilliant I was. It very much appeared to be a banner year for me. And in many ways it was, and it was also one of the loneliest times in my life. I was, living this life where I did my work in the spotlight, right? And I was, charming and young and energetic, and I would try to personify this completely idealized version of myself, and then I would go home and collapse, right? I didn't know anybody besides my wife who knew me as anything other than this image I had created of what I thought a minister should be, and it is exhausting. It is toxic to spend your life never feeling truly seen. So on my days off, I would just kind of sit there in our apartment downtown and try to personify an Edward Hopper painting, right? Like I would just kind of sit there and look out the window until eventually Sandra would come into the room and say, maybe you'd feel better if you did something. And so I would get in my car and just kind of drive around and drink coffee until I could go back to the church and start the whole thing over again. And I remember trying so hard to make sure that none of the personal struggles I was having got anywhere near my work, right? It felt really important at the time to keep all that stuff inside, telling myself I was protecting the congregation when really I was trying to protect myself. And, now I have worked hard to build meaningful relationships in my outside life, and I have, been on this journey to wholeness and happiness that has been wonderful, but it has been a journey. And I've been thinking about that journey, and I've been thinking about this particular section of the Talmud, like you do. And I think this section of the Talmud it's worth looking at when we talk about this. The Church of the River has been suffering through listening to their Jewish UU minister talk about the Talmud for months now. But if some of our friends in Ann Arbor maybe aren't as familiar, the Talmud is an ancient Jewish text where these rabbis, these brilliant rabbis, interpret various Jewish laws, and they tell stories and make arguments with each other about those interpretations. And I've been studying the Talmud for the last few months with a rabbi friend of mine, and we've been looking at this section about walls. And specifically, they're asking the question, under what circumstances is it okay to build a wall? And who is responsible for paying for that wall? In case you were wondering, as far as we can tell, from a Talmudic perspective, Mexico doesn't owe this country a thing. But there's a subsection in the wall discussion where the rabbis are talking about whether or not it is okay to build a wall because you don't want to see or be seen by your neighbor. And they, for pages and pages, they keep coming back to this question of whether or not sight counts as damage, right? Because a part of what goes on in the Talmud is figuring out how to compensate people for damage that has been caused to them. So they're asking, does it hurt somebody if they see you and when they don't want to see you? And does it hurt you if somebody sees you when you don't want them to see you, right? And, because it's the Talmud, the answer that they kind of circle around is sometimes or maybe. And then they spend a lot of time discussing what that means, and if you do build a wall, how big it should be and where, and what the, how tall it can be, and basically what are the limits on how much privacy a person can ask for. And what I love about this section isn't so much the arguing about the bricks and cubits, but it's this idea that, so here we have this ancient text where people are lifting up the distinction between their public selves and their private selves, and they are working hard to protect that division. Right? It's this passage where people are trying really hard to control which part of themselves the world sees. And to make sure that what of themselves the world sees is just what they want the world to see. And these are people in positions of religious leadership, right? They're people in positions that are not entirely different from what I do, saying, look, I really don't need anybody to see what goes on in my house. And so I read this and I wonder if really maybe these ancient, brilliant rabbis, underneath all of this conversation, there was a part of them that didn't want people to see how lonely they were, that didn't want people to see their Edward Hopper moments, because it does hurt. It does cause damage, doesn't it? To have people see the sides of you that you would rather keep from them. This is what makes the Hopper paintings so impactful, is that they show people's loneliest moments, the moments that we don't want anyone to see because they're hard to even talk about. Author Olivia Lang, in her book, The Lonely City, describes the experience of loneliness as being less about a lack of company and more about a combination of being alone and exposed. And incidentally, she spends a whole lot of time talking about Edward Hopper. And she posits that loneliness is not about being solitary, but about being unknown. It's the experience of going through your life and feeling as though there isn't anybody who really knows the real you. Meaning, that loneliness has very little to do with how many people are around you and much more to do with what kind of relationships you have with those people. And in that sense, I would argue that even before this pandemic had started, America was in the midst of a crisis of loneliness. As the way that we communicate with each other has gotten more and more digital, we have had more and more opportunities to control what parts of us the world sees and to present those parts of us that we want to present as our whole selves. And I worry about what that means. For us to present such an idealized picture of our lives, and this is not simply a product of the social media age, right? It's nothing new for people to have a public and a private self. It's nothing new for people to have misgivings about how different those two selves are and to want to try to keep that from the world. I mean, people were writing about it in the Talmud hundreds of years ago, but it is perhaps more important now than ever in the era of Instagram and Facebook and Twitter and all of the things that I began this service by saying, follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. It is more important now than ever for us to be talking about this distinction, especially when we're all trying to stay home, right? When right now, the safe thing for us to do is to not be physically around a lot of other people. It can be so easy for the public-facing parts of ourselves to be the only thing that anybody sees, right? When our primary means of accessing other people is a means that encourages us to be at our most photogenic, at our hippest, we all run the risk of being seen but not known, and moving towards a place of loneliness and isolation from our fellow human beings. And the danger of moving towards that place of loneliness is not simply that it's detrimental to our own mental health, it also creates disconnects that are dangerous in and of themselves, right? Because when we are disconnected to other people, that can lead us to the sort of toxic American individualism that we seem to be seeing everywhere right now, right? This is what can lead us to do things like refuse to wear a face mask in public, or refuse to listen to the stories and experiences of oppressed people, or support candidates who are willing to oppress and dehumanize entire groups of people. When we are so disconnected from each other that we cease to care about other people's well-being, our society genuinely cannot function. And when we do not feel truly seen, it becomes all too easy for us to stop seeing other people, because it does hurt. It does cause damage, as the rabbis would say, to go your whole life and not be seen by anybody. And when you are hurt in this way, it becomes that much easier for you to inflict this kind of hurt on others. And so this is one of the most important tasks of our congregations, is to create meaningful connections between people. This was important work for us to do before the COVID-19 pandemic, before the era of social media, and it's only gotten more important as time has gone on. Right? The first principle of Unitarian Universalism, we covenant to affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person. Implicit in that is we covenant to affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of all of every person, right? And that doesn't mean that everybody has to share everything about who they are when they walk into a UU congregation, right? What it means is that our congregations must be places where you can walk in and know that everybody knows that all of who you are is in there, and that you are welcomed and loved for all of who you are. right? Because boundaries are a good thing, but it is problematic if we over-editorialize every aspect of how we appear to every other person to the point where we feel unknown and, by extension, alone. And that is a crucial part of the church's work, the church's radical work, because in this era, it is a radical act to present our whole selves and to work to be comfortable with our whole selves and to work to be comfortable with all of other people's whole selves. I mean, I like to have fun and, make the congregation that I serve do the hokey pokey every year, the church hokey pokey, mostly because I think it's hilarious, but it is also important to me to create a space where we can bring our whole selves in and have our whole selves be shaken all about and then turned around and go out into the world feeling a bit more ready to build meaningful connections with other people's whole selves. Even before this pandemic, even before social media, this is crucial to us as UUs, to create spaces that welcome and value each lonely, messy, broken person who brings their whole self in. And during this COVID-19 pandemic, it has become that much more important for us to find ways to truly connect with our fellow human beings. And this time has certainly made these connections more difficult, right? But they are not impossible. Unitarian Universalists, we have this reverence, right, for human ingenuity. This is a moment for that ingenuity, for us to realize that we are capable of making this work. This can mean something as simple as picking up a phone or taking a socially distant walk together or getting together a quarantine, right, a group of people who agree to see each other as they shelter in place. There are ways that we can make this work, and I have to tell you, there's a weird level on which my experience of this pandemic hasn't had the Edward Hopper vibe that I was expecting it to. There are ways in which I have felt more connected to other people than I have in a long time. And I think that's largely because of the people who I have in my life who have been able to see and love my actual self. I want to tell you all this one more story before we wrap up here. It was a little more than 20 years ago. It was maybe in 98 or 99. I was in the 6th grade, and my mom, who was also a UU minister, took me to this party at Bill Sinkford's house. Bill Sinkford was the president of the Unitarian Universalist Association at the time, and so it was this very fancy party with all these very important ministers, and they were very on, right? They were very diplomatic, but very clever. And I was in the 6th grade, so naturally I thought this was so boring, I wanted to explode. And I just kind of sat in the corner, wearing the polo shirt that my mom had made me put on. But there was this one guy there who seemed different. He was this young, hotshot minister. I think he was somewhere in his 20s. And I just remember he laughed really loudly, and he talked about how he played ice hockey and drove a Mustang, and just really didn't seem to care what any of the other guests thought. He was determined to bring his real self, and I remember feeling drawn to him and thinking, that's the kind of person that I want to hang out with, right? He was an interesting but safe person in this sea of boring. And so I kind of just went over and I was like, hey. And he said, hey, my name's Manish. Who are you? And this, of course, was the Reverend Manish Mishra Marzetti, now serving the UU congregation in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And so we talked and we began to form one of the deepest and most important friendships of my life, which started with Manish allowing his whole self to be really seen in a way that gave me permission to be my whole self, and led all these years later to our congregations coming together in the midst of this profoundly isolating global disaster and trying to really see and learn from each other, that we may go out into the world to try and see and welcome others as well. Amen.